February 4th, 2009, 5:30 in the morning. A restaurant near downtown Tokyo. The city still sleeps under winter darkness, but inside, fluorescent lights illuminate a scene that belongs in a fever dream. A 75-year-old man sits at a table, drinking beer for breakfast. Around him, a semicircle of young women with cameras and notepads, television reporters, magazine journalists, all attractive, all female, all leaning forward, hanging on every word. The man's name is Kazutsugi Nami, and he's charging each of them 10,000 yen for this privilege. A paid session. An audience with a profit. Outside, unmarked police vehicles roll through empty streets toward this location. Inside, Nami takes another sip of beer and makes a prediction. In 3 years, he says, countries around the world will adopt his invention. The ENTEN. Money from heaven. A currency that never disappears, that multiplies endlessly, that exists in the air itself. He will become world famous. He's leading 50,000 people, he tells the cameras. Can they really charge a company this big with fraud? The women scribble in their notebooks. Some of them, according to rumors that will surface later, have spent nights in his apartment. Information for access. Access for stories. In 90 minutes, detectives will walk through that door and arrest him for orchestrating one of the largest financial frauds in Japanese history. But the question that will linger for years afterward isn't about guilt or innocence. He'd already served prison time for previous schemes. Everyone knew his history. The question is simpler and more disturbing. 37,000 people gave him their money anyway. 2 weeks earlier, on December 11th, 2008, FBI agents arrested Bernard Madoff in his Manhattan penthouse. $65 billion. The largest Ponzi scheme in American history. The news ricocheted around the world like a financial gunshot. Markets were already hemorrhaging from the Lehman Brothers collapse 3 months prior. Now this. Proof that even the most sophisticated investors, the wealthiest institutions, could be fooled by a simple lie dressed in complexity. Japan watched these arrests with particular attention because Japan had its own Madoff, not as famous internationally, not as wealthy in lifestyle, but perhaps more audacious in concept. Kazutsugi Nami hadn't just promised returns, he'd invented an entire currency. The ENTEN, written in kanji as ENTEN, circular heaven, or more poetically, money from heaven. A digital currency that existed on mobile phones, distributed through a company called LNG, which stood for Ladies and Gentlemen. The mechanics seemed almost childishly simple. Invest 100,000 yen with LNG. Every year, receive 100,000 ENTEN. Use those ENTEN to buy products at special fairs. Futons, vegetables, clothing, jewelry, electronics. The list grew monthly. The genius of the system was its self-contained ecosystem. Real yen went in, virtual ENTEN came out. And because ENTEN could only be spent within LNG's network, the money never actually left the system. It just circulated endlessly, like blood through a closed circulatory system. No one asked the obvious question until it was too late. Where did the value come from? Who was manufacturing these futons, growing these vegetables, making this jewelry? The answer, of course, was that someone had to be paid in real money, and the only source of real money was new investors. 37,000 people. Minimum losses estimated at 126 billion yen. Some calculations put the figure closer to 226 billion, between 1.4 and 2.5 billion dollars, depending on exchange rates and which accountant you asked. The Japanese financial authorities would later admit they'd investigated LNG multiple times starting in 2007, but the structure was so unusual, so unprecedented, that they couldn't immediately classify it as fraud. Virtual currencies didn't exist in law yet. The ENTEN occupied a legal gray zone, a space between gift certificates and securities, between club memberships and investments. Nami had found a crack in reality and wedged an entire economy into it. 1973. Kazutsugi Nami was 40 years old and already an expert in making something from nothing. His resume included a stint as vice president of APO Japan, a company that sold exhaust pipe attachments supposed to reduce emissions and improve fuel efficiency. The devices did neither. APO Japan collapsed, taking approximately 250,000 investors down with it, 250,000 people. Nami walked away, learned his lessons, and started fresh. He founded Nozaku Corporation and began selling what he called magic stones. Place these rocks in water, he claimed, and the liquid would transform into natural mineral water with health benefits. The stones were ordinary rocks. The health benefits were imaginary. The sales were real. For 5 years, people bought those rocks, placed them in their drinking water, and convinced themselves they felt better. The placebo effect generated substantial revenue until 1978, when police finally arrested him. Fraud. He served time. Not much, but enough to understand the system better. When he emerged in the mid-1980s, Kazutsugi Nami was in his early 50s, twice convicted, and absolutely convinced he'd figured out the formula. The pattern was clear. Each scheme had grown more sophisticated. Exhaust pipes were physical products with testable claims, easy to debunk. Magic stones were subtler. Health benefits are subjective, personal, difficult to measure, but both involve tangible objects that could be examined, tested, proven false. The next iteration would need to be completely abstract. In 1987, Nami founded LNG. Ladies and gentlemen, on the surface, it was a legitimate bedding company. Futons, pillows, mattresses. The products were real, manufactured by actual suppliers, sold through normal retail channels. For nearly 2 decades, LNG operated as an ordinary business. Nami stayed quiet, paid his taxes, kept his record clean. He was rebuilding credibility, establishing legitimacy, waiting. The Japanese economy had collapsed in 1990, and the entire nation was crawling through what economists would later call the lost decade, though it would actually stretch for 20 years. Banks held non-performing loans. Real estate values had cratered. The stock market had lost more than half its value. And perhaps most importantly, Japan was aging faster than any society in human history. By 2004, nearly 20% of the population was over 65. These elderly Japanese had saved their entire lives, following the cultural imperative of thrift and preparation. They'd accumulated substantial nest eggs during the boom years. Now those savings sat in bank accounts earning essentially zero interest, slowly losing value to inflation, while their owners wondered how to make the money last through retirement that could stretch 20 or 30 years. They were financially comfortable, but psychologically terrified. Perfect. 2004. Nami was 71 years old and ready to launch his masterpiece. LNG announced a revolutionary new system, the ENTEN. Customers could invest minimum amounts of 100,000 yen with the company. They would receive an equivalent amount of ENTEN annually, not a one-time payment, annually, forever. The promise was explicit. Your principal never diminished. You kept receiving ENTEN equal to your original investment every single year. A 100,000 yen investment generated 100,000 ten the first year, another 100,000 the second year, another 100,000 the third year. If calculated as a conventional return rate, this was 100% annually. But LNG didn't frame it that way. This wasn't interest. This wasn't investment income. This was a new economic model entirely. Nami called it a mutual assistance system. Everyone helped everyone else. The ENTEN existed outside traditional capitalism, beyond the reach of banks and governments, a parallel economy based on cooperation rather than competition. The psychology was brilliant. Japanese society operates on principles of reciprocity and group harmony. The concept of mutual assistance, of everyone supporting the collective, resonated deeply. This wasn't greedy speculation. This was community building. And the ENTEN could only be spent at special LNG fairs, which meant you weren't converting digital currency back into yen. You were participating in an ecosystem. The fairs themselves became legendary, held in expensive Tokyo hotels, the Imperial Hotel, Hotel Okura, venues that conferred status and legitimacy. Thousands of people, mostly elderly, mostly women, gathering in ballrooms to shop with their ENTEN. Tables laden with products, not just futons anymore. Electronics, cosmetics, food, jewelry, art. The selection expanded constantly. And the prices seemed reasonable, even generous. A futon that might cost 50,000 yen in a regular store was priced at 40,000 at the fair. You were getting a discount. You were getting a deal. The fact that you'd paid real yen to acquire those ENTEN somehow vanished in the excitement of spending them. The fairs took on an almost religious atmosphere. Music played, celebrities appeared on stage. Takashi Hosokawa, a famous enka singer, performed at events, and appeared in LNG promotional materials. His presence validated the enterprise. If a nationally known artist endorsed the system, it must be legitimate. Scientists and academics gave presentations about the economic theory behind the ENTEN. Nami himself would take the stage, not as a salesman, but as a visionary, explaining his philosophy. He spoke about creating a world without economic anxiety, where money flowed endlessly, where the elderly could live without fear. People applauded. Some cried. A 70-year-old woman would later tell reporters, "I had fun and a lively life at the meetings." The fairs weren't just shopping events. They were social gatherings, community celebrations, a chance for isolated retirees to feel part of something larger. And that feeling was worth more than money, until it wasn't. To understand why 37,000 people believed in money from heaven, you have to understand what was happening to Japan in the early 2000s. The country was conducting an experiment no nation had attempted before, aging at unprecedented speed while maintaining first-world living standards. In 1995, 14.5% of Japanese were over 65. By 2005, that figure hit 20%. By 2010, it would reach 23%. The society was graying so fast that economists coined a new term, super-aged society, defined as one where more than 21% of the population is elderly. Japan was the first to cross that threshold. The implications were staggering. These weren't poor elderly living in poverty. They were middle-class retirees who'd worked their entire careers during Japan's economic miracle. They'd saved diligently. The national savings rate in 1998 was 11.4%. These people had substantial nest eggs. But here was the problem. Their savings were sitting in banks paying 0.1% interest. Inflation was minimal, but medical costs were rising. Life expectancy was increasing. A 65-year-old woman in 2005 could expect to live another 23 years. A man, another 18 years. Could their savings last that long? Worse, the social safety net was fraying. Japan's pension system was designed when life expectancy was lower and the working-age population was larger. Now there were fewer young workers supporting more retirees. Benefits were being cut. Retirement ages were being pushed back. The psychological impact was crushing. These people had followed all the rules. They'd worked hard, saved money, delayed gratification. They'd done everything society told them to do. And now, in their final decades, they watched their carefully accumulated wealth slowly evaporate through inflation and bank fees while the economy stagnated. The government offered no solutions. Banks offered no returns. Traditional investments seemed risky after the stock market crash. What options remained? When Kazutsugi Nami appeared on television and in newspaper advertisements explaining the ENTEN system, he wasn't just offering financial returns. He was offering hope, a way out, a system specifically designed for people exactly like them. And he was 71 years old himself, one of them. Not some young banker in a suit, a fellow retiree who understood their fears because he shared them. The social dynamics made the scheme even more effective. In Japanese culture, major financial decisions are often made collectively within family or friend networks. Isolation is a powerful fear. Loneliness among the elderly was becoming a national crisis. The ENTEN fairs provided community. Women would attend together, groups of friends shopping and socializing. If one friend invested, she'd encourage others to join. Not out of malice, but out of genuine enthusiasm. She was getting ENTEN. She was buying futons. It was working for her. Why wouldn't her friends want the same benefits? This viral recruitment mechanism meant LNG didn't need aggressive salespeople. The elderly were recruiting each other, validating each other's decisions, reinforcing the group belief. To pull out would mean admitting you'd been fooled, which would cause you to lose face. Worse, it might mean being excluded from the social circle. Better to stay in, keep investing, keep believing. The financial commitment became indistinguishable from the social one. Emiko was 74 years old when she first heard about LNG. The name has been changed in media reports, but the story is real. She'd been a school principal, spent 40 years in education, retired with a solid pension and substantial savings. Not wealthy, but comfortable, secure. She lived alone in a modest apartment in suburban Tokyo. Her husband had died a decade earlier. Her children lived in other cities, busy with their own families. She saw them twice a year if she was lucky. Television and telephone calls filled the gaps. Then a friend invited her to an ENTEN fair, just to look, just to see. The hotel ballroom was packed. Hundreds of women her age, chatting excitedly, examining products, making purchases with their phones. The technology was new to Emiko. She'd only recently gotten a mobile phone and still struggled with text messages. But the staff at the fair were patient, helpful. They loaded a small amount of ENTEN onto her phone as a demonstration. Free money, a gift. She used it to buy a small decorative item, a ceramic vase. It was so easy. She felt a small thrill of pleasure. Her friend explained the system. Invest 100,000 yen, receive 100,000 ENTEN every year, forever. Emiko did the math. She had several million yen in savings. If she invested even a portion, the annual ENTEN would give her extra spending money, and her principal would remain untouched, still sitting in the bank. It seemed safe. Conservative even. She invested 300. That first year, 300,000 ENTEN appeared on her phone. She attended another fair and bought a futon. A good one. Expensive. She'd been meaning to replace her old futon for years. She also bought some kitchenware and a piece of jewelry. The ENTEN covered it all. She showed the bracelet to her friend, who was wearing a similar one. They laughed. They'd both gotten such good deals. The next year, another 300,000 ENTEN arrived. Emiko bought more items, Christmas gifts for her grandchildren, products she'd normally have paid real money for, but she was spending ENTEN instead, which meant her bank account wasn't shrinking. In fact, she was saving money. She increased her investment to 1 million yen, then 2 million. Her friend kept encouraging her. Why hold money in a bank earning nothing? Why not put it in LNG where it generated ENTEN? The logic seemed sound. Over 3 years, Emiko invested approximately 40 million yen, about $400,000 at 2007 exchange rates. It represented the majority of her life savings. Every yen she'd saved over 40 years of work. She told herself it was fine. She was getting ENTEN. She was shopping at the fairs. The system was working. In February 2007, she tried to attend a fair but discovered it had been canceled. No explanation. She called LNG's office. Busy signal. She called her friend. Her friend had heard rumors. Something about lawsuits. Something about police investigations. But surely it was a misunderstanding. Emiko's ENTEN was still on her phone. The numbers glowed on her screen. 4.2 million ENTEN. She'd accumulated so much. It was worth millions of yen. Except it wasn't. Because there was nowhere to spend it anymore. The fairs stopped. The office stopped answering phones. And in November 2007, LNG declared bankruptcy. Emiko's 40 million yen was gone. She filed a complaint with police, joining hundreds of other victims, but she never spoke publicly about it. Too ashamed, too embarrassed. She'd been a school principal, an educated woman. How could she have been so stupid? Years later, in a brief anonymous interview, she admitted she'd known something was wrong by the end. The promises were too good, the returns too high. But she'd wanted to believe. She'd needed to believe. Because the alternative was admitting she'd destroyed her own security, and she couldn't face that. So she'd kept going to fairs, kept spending ENTEN, kept pretending the system would last forever. It's my fault, she told the reporter. I was greedy. To sell paradise, Nami understood. You needed angels. Beautiful ones. LNG recruited a group of young women called the Cosmo Girls. Hostesses, essentially, but the job description was more complex than traditional hostess work. They attended ENTEN fairs as staff, helping elderly customers load ENTEN onto their phones, explaining products, taking orders. They were paid 300,000 yen per month, about $2,800. For young women in Tokyo, many of whom were working multiple part-time jobs to pay rent, this was substantial income. LNG also provided free apartments, not luxury housing, but decent accommodation in the city. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. The women got financial stability. LNG got an attractive, friendly, female presence at every event, and Nami got access. Reports suggest, though details remain murky, that some of the Cosmo girls were encouraged to accompany Nami to dinners, to social events, occasionally to his apartment. The line between professional obligation and personal request blurred deliberately. Nothing was demanded explicitly. Everything was implied. If you wanted to keep your job, your apartment, your income, You made yourself available. You smiled at his jokes. You laughed at his predictions. You made him feel important. The television stations and magazines caught on quickly. When they wanted to interview Nami, they sent their most attractive female reporters. Nami granted these journalists extended access, multiple interviews, behind-the-scenes tours of LNG facilities. Male reporters got brief phone conversations if they were lucky. Female reporters got hours of FaceTime. Some allegedly got more. In January 2009, with police investigations closing in, rumors circulated that Nami had deliberately leaked his own arrest date to certain journalists. Not altruistically. He charged them for the information. 10,000 yen for a breakfast session where he'd be present when detectives arrived. Photo opportunity. Exclusive footage. Several television stations paid. One magazine reporter allegedly spent the night of February 3rd in Nami's apartment, leaving early the next morning just hours before the arrest. The reporter's network would later air footage of the arrest itself, suggesting they'd positioned cameras in advance. The ethics of this arrangement didn't particularly concern anyone. This was business, information for money, access for opportunity. Beyond the Cosmo Girls, Nami assembled an impressive roster of celebrities and intellectuals to endorse the ENTEN system. Takashi Hosokawa, the enka singer, appeared at multiple fairs and in promotional videos. Enka is traditional Japanese folk ballad music, popular primarily among older generations. Hosokawa's presence signaled that this was culturally legitimate, that LNG respected traditional values while innovating economically. Scientists and economists gave presentations at fairs explaining the theoretical basis for the ENTEN. Most of these academics were real, with actual credentials, though their understanding of what LNG was actually doing remains questionable. Either they were fooled themselves, or they were paid to look the other way. In 2007, Nami created something called Akari Laboratory, registered as a non-profit organization, a research institute supposedly studying alternative economic models and mutual assistance systems. The NPO status conferred legitimacy and provided tax advantages. Akari Laboratory hosted symposiums where academics discussed the future of money, the possibility of virtual currencies, the benefits of community-based economics. It all sounded tremendously forward-thinking. None of it addressed the fundamental question of where the ENTEN's value originated. But by surrounding himself with scientists, celebrities, attractive women, and institutional structures, Nami created a web of credibility that was difficult to dismiss as simple fraud. This wasn't some street corner con. This was an organization with headquarters, staff, celebrity endorsements, academic research, and tens of thousands of satisfied members. Until suddenly, it wasn't. February 2007. LNG made an announcement that sent tremors through its membership. Dividend payments would no longer include cash options, only ENTEN. This was framed as expansion of the ENTEN ecosystem, a sign of the currency's growing strength and acceptance. In reality, it was a desperate measure. The mathematics of the scheme had always been impossible. For every 100,000 yen invested, LNG had to pay out 100,000 yen worth of value annually forever. Even if they'd invested the principal conservatively and earned 5% returns, they'd only generate 5,000 yen per year per investor. They were promising 20 times that amount. The only way to sustain payments was constant influx of new money. Classic Ponzi mechanics. By 2007, recruitment had slowed. The economy was still stagnant. Potential investors were becoming scarcer, and existing members were expecting their ENTEN payments. Paying only in ENTEN rather than cash solved the immediate problem. LNG could create ENTEN out of thin air, just numbers in a database, but it destroyed member confidence. People had joined expecting annual cash benefits. Now they were receiving only virtual currency. What good was ENTEN if you couldn't convert it to real money? Members started demanding account closures and refund of their principal. LNG stalled, delayed, made excuses. Refund requests were being processed. Checks were in the mail. Meanwhile, more ENTEN fairs were being scheduled. Come spend your ENTEN. Buy products. Don't worry about cash. In May 2007, a group of 33 members filed a lawsuit in Osaka District Court demanding return of their investments, totaling approximately 7.5 million yen. The suit claimed LNG's system constituted illegal financial transactions. This was the first serious legal challenge. Others followed. By summer 2007, multiple lawsuits were pending. Hundreds of members were demanding refunds, and media coverage was turning negative. October 2007, police raided LNG headquarters in Tokyo. Officers seized computers, financial records, membership lists. The official reason was investigation of possible violations of financial regulations. LNG had never registered as a securities firm, had never obtained proper licensing for managing investments. The raid made national news. Television footage showed boxes of documents being carried out. Nami appeared briefly on camera, insisting everything was legitimate, that LNG was being persecuted for innovating outside traditional banking systems. His performance was confident, but the damage was done. Members saw police raiding the headquarters and understood what that meant. November 2007, LNG declared bankruptcy. Official debts were listed as approximately 3.1 billion yen, though this figure seemed deliberately understated. The company claimed it had 10,000 members, but evidence suggested the number was closer to 37,000. Meetings scheduled for that month were canceled. The phone lines were disconnected. ENTEN fairs ceased, and members were left holding mobile phones displaying millions of ENTEN that could no longer buy anything. The numbers remained on their screens like tombstones marking the death of a dream. Yet Nami himself wasn't arrested. Not yet. He'd structured LNG carefully, with multiple subsidiary companies and complex corporate arrangements. Proving criminal fraud required demonstrating intentional deception rather than business failure. Prosecutors began building their case, interviewing victims, tracing money flows, analyzing records seized in the raid. It would take 15 more months. During that time, Nami remained free. He continued giving interviews. He insisted the ENTEN would be vindicated. He predicted that global financial instability would prove the need for alternative currencies. And then, in September 2008, he suddenly looked prophetic. September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers Holdings filed for bankruptcy. The fourth largest investment bank in the United States, destroyed overnight. Stock markets plunged globally. Credit froze. Banks stopped lending. Within weeks, the global financial system was in freefall. Japan, despite its economic stagnation, had maintained stability through conservative banking practices and high savings rates. But the country's economy was heavily dependent on exports, particularly automobiles and electronics. When American and European consumers stopped buying, Japanese factories stopped producing. October 2008, Japan's exports fell 7.7% year-over-year. November, down 26.7%. December, down 35%. January 2009, down 45%. By February 2009, exports had collapsed 49.4%, and in March they would crater 45.6%. The Japanese economy contracted at an annualized rate of 12.1% in the first quarter of 2009, the worst performance since the 1974 oil crisis. Major manufacturers announced massive layoffs. Toyota, Honda, Sony, Panasonic all cut production and shed workers. The unemployment rate, traditionally low in Japan, began climbing. For elderly Japanese watching their modest stock portfolios lose a third of their value, watching news of bank failures and corporate bankruptcies, the 2008 financial crisis confirmed their worst fears. The system was broken. Traditional finance was corrupt. Banks couldn't be trusted. Wall Street had destroyed the world economy through greed and speculation. Against this backdrop, Nami's ENTEN scheme almost seemed reasonable by comparison. At least he'd been honest about creating money from nothing. At least he hadn't pretended his system was backed by sophisticated financial instruments that turned out to be garbage. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The legal financial system had just evaporated trillions of dollars. But Nami was the criminal? December 11, 2008. Bernard Madoff was arrested at his Manhattan apartment. The numbers were staggering. $65 billion in stated account values. Actual losses around $18 billion. Victims included Steven Spielberg, Kevin Bacon, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, multiple charities, university endowments, pension funds, banks. Madoff had been running the scam for at least 17 years, possibly longer. He'd been a respected figure on Wall Street, former chairman of NASDAQ, trusted by sophisticated investors worldwide. And it was all fake. Every statement, every return, every dollar of profit. Fiction. The SEC had investigated him multiple times and found nothing wrong. The parallels to Nami were obvious, but also misleading. Madoff had targeted wealthy institutions. Nami targeted elderly individuals. Madoff promised steady returns of 10 to 12% annually. Nami promised 100%. Madoff's scheme was opaque, hidden behind complicated trading strategies. Nami's scheme was transparent about creating virtual currency. Madoff maintained an elaborate performance of legitimacy for decades. Nami had been in prison twice before starting LNG. Yet, in a strange way, Nami's transparency made his fraud more honest. He told people he was creating money from nothing. He called it money from heaven. The name itself was almost satirical, and people believed anyway because they wanted to, because they needed to, because the alternative was sitting on savings that earned nothing while the world fell apart. When Japanese prosecutors finally arrested Nami in February 2009, 2 months after Madoff's arrest, the timing seemed almost coordinated, a global crackdown on financial fraud, justice being served. But it also felt hollow. The legitimate financial system had just destroyed far more wealth than Madoff and Nami combined, and none of those bankers, regulators, or ratings agencies were being arrested. January 2009. Nami knew the arrest was coming. Police had been investigating for over a year. Multiple lawsuits were pending. LNG had declared bankruptcy. The only question was timing, so he decided to profit from it one last time. He contacted several television stations and magazines through intermediaries. He had information about his arrest date, he said, when and where it would happen, exclusive access, but it would cost them 10,000 yen per person, approximately $110. Some journalists balked. Paying sources was ethically dubious. But this wasn't payment for information. This was payment for access to a scene, like buying tickets to a show. Several outlets agreed. The morning of February 4th was carefully choreographed. Nami chose a restaurant near his Tokyo office. Small, intimate, the kind of place where you could have a private conversation in a public space. He arrived early, around 5 a.m., ordered beer. At 75 years old, drinking beer for breakfast might have seemed eccentric, but Nami had always cultivated an image of unconventionality. By 5:30, several female reporters had arrived. They set up their cameras discreetly, notepads out, recording devices ready. Nami held court. He answered questions about LNG, about the ENTEN, about his philosophy. He was relaxed, almost jovial. Someone asked him about the fraud allegations. He bristled. "No, I have put my life at stake. Why do I have to apologize? I'm the poorest victim. Nobody lost more than I did." The logic was genuinely fascinating. In Nami's mind, he was the greatest victim of the ENTEN's collapse. He'd built this system. He'd believed in it. He'd tried to create something revolutionary, and small-minded regulators and bitter investors had destroyed it. They couldn't see the vision. They couldn't understand that the ENTEN represented a fundamental restructuring of economics. In 3 years, he predicted, the global financial crisis would force countries to adopt alternative currencies, virtual money, digital value systems. And the ENTEN would be recognized as pioneering. He would be vindicated. He would be world famous. Someone mentioned the police investigation. Nami took another drink of beer. Time will tell if I'm a con man or a swindler. I'm leading 50,000 people. Can they charge a company this big with fraud? The number was inflated. Evidence suggested 37,000 members, not 50,000. But the principle remained. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was a movement. Thousands of people had participated willingly, enthusiastically. They'd attended fairs. They'd recruited friends. They'd spent their ENTEN. Were they all victims, or were they participants in an economic experiment that had failed? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Around 7 a.m., plainclothes detectives entered the restaurant. They approached Nami's table politely, formally. They identified themselves. They asked him to come with them. Nami stood slowly, calmly. The cameras captured everything. He didn't resist, didn't protest. He walked out between the detectives like a man heading to an appointment he'd scheduled himself, which, in a sense, he had. The reporters got their footage. The story would lead the evening news. And Nami got one last performance, one final chance to control the narrative. He'd been arrested, yes, but on his terms, in a scene he'd arranged before an audience he'd assembled. Even in defeat, he was directing the show. That same day, police arrested 21 other LNG executives and associates. The dragnet was comprehensive. Officers raided multiple locations, seized additional records, froze bank accounts. The formal charges were violation of the Investment Deposit and Interest Rate Act and fraud. Prosecutors stated that between 2001 and 2009, LNG had collected approximately 119 billion yen from investors while knowing the business model was unsustainable. The actual figure was likely higher, but proving exact amounts was complicated by LNG's deliberately opaque record-keeping. After the arrests, attorney Hajime Chiba established a legal team to represent victims. Within weeks, approximately 900 people had joined the class action lawsuit, but that number represented only a fraction of LNG's membership. Most victims never came forward. Some were too embarrassed. Admitting you'd lost money in an obvious scam meant admitting you'd been foolish, gullible, greedy. In a culture that valued social harmony and personal dignity, such admissions were unbearable. Better to suffer the loss privately than expose yourself to judgment and pity. Others remained silent because of how they'd become involved. LNG's viral recruitment structure meant most members had been brought in by friends or family. A woman who'd lost money had probably convinced her sister to invest. That sister had probably recruited a neighbor. The neighbor had brought her book club. The network of complicity was vast. Coming forward meant potentially exposing the person who'd recruited you, who might have genuinely believed in the ENTEN and was now equally devastated. It meant revealing that you'd recruited others, that you bore partial responsibility for their losses. The web of social obligation and mutual embarrassment kept thousands of victims silent. They got involved through solicitation of their friends, attorney Chiba explained to reporters. Even if they suffered losses, they don't dare to talk about it as they fear being avoided in society. This dynamic protected Nami even after arrest. Many victims were more angry at themselves than at him. He'd made promises. They'd chosen to believe. Personal responsibility ran deep in Japanese culture. A 65-year-old woman who'd lost 30 million yen told reporters she'd saved that money over 40 years of work. Everything she had, gone. But she insisted it was her own fault. She should have known better. She should have been less greedy. The 70-year-old woman, who admitted she'd had fun and a lively life at the ENTEN fairs, expressed similar sentiments. Yes, she'd lost money. Yes, the system had been fraudulent. But she'd enjoyed participating. She'd made friends. She'd felt part of a community. It's my fault as I was greedy, she concluded. This self-blame served multiple psychological purposes. It preserved agency. If the loss was your fault, then you'd made a choice, exercised free will, remained in control. The alternative was accepting that you'd been manipulated, controlled, victimized by someone smarter and more ruthless than you. That was more threatening to self-concept than admitting greed. It also preserved belief in a just world. If you lost money because you were greedy, then the universe made sense. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen when people make mistakes. But if you could be victimized despite doing everything right, then safety was an illusion and no one was secure. Better to believe you'd erred than to believe the world was genuinely dangerous. Some victims had lost relatively small amounts, a few $1,000s, painful but not catastrophic. Others had lost everything: life savings, money meant for medical care, for supporting grandchildren, for funeral expenses. Several elderly victims had no recourse, too old to return to work, too proud to ask family for help. They would spend their remaining years in poverty because they'd trusted a man selling heaven. One 74-year-old former school principal, almost certainly Emiko, though her identity was protected, had lost approximately $400,000. She'd invested gradually over 3 years, convinced by friends and by her own observations that the system was working. By the time she realized the truth, she'd committed the majority of her savings. She filed a complaint with police, but told almost no one else. Her adult children learned about it months later, and only because they noticed she'd become unusually frugal, declining to visit them, making excuses about expenses. When they pressed her, she admitted what had happened. They were sympathetic, but also bewildered. How could someone so educated fall for something so obvious? She had no answer that satisfied them. March 18, 2010. Tokyo District Court. Judge Yoshio Tsuchiya presiding. Kazutsugi Nami, now 76 years old, faced formal charges of fraud involving 327 million yen and 31 specific investors. This was only a fraction of the total scheme. Prosecutors had selected a representative sample of victims to build a manageable case. Proving fraud for all 37,000 members and 126 to 226 billion yen would have required years of litigation. By focusing on clear-cut cases, they could secure a conviction and meaningful prison sentence without endless appeals. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Nami had promised returns that were mathematically impossible. He'd created a virtual currency with no underlying value. He'd paid early investors with money from later investors. Classic Ponzi mechanics dressed in innovative language. The victims testified. A 68-year-old woman described investing 8 million yen over 2 years, believing she was participating in a mutual assistance system. She'd received end payments as promised, but when she tried to withdraw her principal in 2007, L&G refused. Eventually, the company collapsed and her money disappeared. A 72-year-old man testified he'd invested 15 million yen based on representations that the ENTEN was a legitimate alternative currency. He'd attended multiple fairs, bought products, recruited 2 friends. He lost everything. Nami's defense was more philosophical than legal. His attorney argued that L&G was attempting to create a genuinely new economic model. The ENTEN wasn't fraud, it was innovation. Virtual currencies were theoretical but not impossible. Major economists had written about alternative monetary systems. L&G had simply tried to implement these theories practically. The fact that the implementation failed didn't constitute criminal fraud. It constituted business failure. Companies fail all the time. Investors lose money. That's capitalism. Should every failed entrepreneur be prosecuted? The argument had a certain logic, but it collapsed under scrutiny. Failed businesses don't promise impossible returns. Failed businesses don't recruit tens of thousands of elderly investors with promises that money will never disappear. And failed businesses are run by people without prior fraud convictions. The prosecution presented evidence of Nami's previous schemes: the APO Japan exhaust pipes, the magic stones, the pattern of creating something from nothing, marketing it aggressively to vulnerable populations, then collapsing when the mathematics caught up with the promises. This wasn't innovation. This was recidivism. A man who'd learned from each previous failure how to make the next scam more sophisticated, more believable, more difficult to prosecute. The ENTEN wasn't ahead of its time. It was a traditional pyramid scheme wrapped in technological language. Judge Tsuchiya deliberated for several weeks before delivering his verdict. Guilty on all charges. Nami had knowingly defrauded investors through false promises and misrepresentations. The ENTEN system was designed to fail from inception. There was no sustainable business model, no legitimate value creation, no possibility of honoring the promises made to members. This was criminal fraud, not business innovation. Sentencing: 18 years in prison. At 76 years old, this was effectively a life sentence. Nami would be 94 if he served the full term. Statistically, he would die in prison. The sentence was severe by Japanese standards, where white-collar criminals often received relatively light punishment. But the judge noted the scale of the fraud, the number of victims, and Nami's prior convictions. This man had been given multiple opportunities to reform. Instead, he'd refined his techniques and expanded his operations. He'd targeted the elderly specifically, exploiting their financial vulnerability and social isolation. He destroyed the retirement savings of thousands of people who could never recover those losses. 18 years was proportionate to the harm caused. Nami showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He nodded slightly, as if confirming something he'd already known. His attorneys filed appeals, arguing the sentence was excessive and that the court had failed to adequately consider L&G's legitimate business activities alongside the ENTEN system. The appeals were denied. Nami began serving his sentence in a Tokyo prison, where he would spend his final years among other elderly inmates, many of whom were there for lesser crimes than his. In 2009, a software developer using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a white paper describing Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. a digital currency with no central authority, maintained by a distributed network of computers using cryptographic verification. In January 2009, the same month Nami was arrested, the Bitcoin network went live. The timing was coincidental, but symbolically loaded. As Japanese police were dismantling the ENTEN, an anonymous programmer was creating the technology that would eventually validate virtual currencies as legitimate financial instruments. By 2013, Bitcoin was trading above $1,000 per coin. By 2017, above $19,000. In 2021, it briefly exceeded $68,000. Ethereum, launched in 2015, enabled smart contracts and spawned an entire ecosystem of decentralized applications. Thousands of cryptocurrencies emerged, each with different technical specifications and use cases. Some were scams, many failed, but the fundamental concept of virtual currency became accepted, mainstream, legitimate. Major corporations began accepting cryptocurrency payments. Investment funds allocated portions of portfolios to digital assets. Governments developed regulations rather than banning the technology outright. Was Kazutsugi Nami a pioneer or a con man? The question is less binary than it appears. The ENTEN was absolutely a fraud. It promised impossible returns. It had no sustainable business model. It was a Ponzi scheme, regardless of terminology. But it also represented a genuine insight into the arbitrary nature of money. Currency has value because people agree it has value. Gold is valuable because societies decided gold was valuable. Paper money is valuable because governments decree it as legal tender and people accept that decree. The dollar in your wallet is worth $1 because everyone agrees it is, not because the paper itself has intrinsic value. Nami understood this. His mistake was thinking he could create that agreement through persuasion alone, without underlying infrastructure, without genuine utility, without the trust that comes from transparent operation rather than charismatic marketing. The ENTEN failed because it was closed. You could only spend it within LNG's ecosystem, which meant it wasn't really a currency. It was a gift certificate. Bitcoin succeeded because it was open. Anyone could accept it. Anyone could trade it. The value was determined by supply and demand across global markets, not by the arbitrary pricing of products at controlled fairs. NFTs, which exploded in popularity in 2021, demonstrated that people would indeed pay real money for virtual items. Digital art, collectibles, status symbols, existing only as blockchain entries. Some of these were scams. Many lost value rapidly. But the mechanism worked because the ownership was verifiable, transferable, and independent of any single company. In a perverse way, Nami's prophecy came partially true. Virtual currencies did gain acceptance. Countries didn't adopt the ENTEN, but several nations explored or implemented central bank digital currencies. El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender in 2021. The financial crisis of 2008 did catalyze interest in alternative monetary systems, exactly as Nami predicted. His failure was one of implementation, not vision. If he'd actually built what he claimed to be building, if the ENTEN had been a genuine cryptocurrency with transparent mechanics and open participation, he might indeed have become world famous. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about the difference between innovation and fraud, between creating something new and simply relabeling something old. Why do intelligent people believe impossible things? The question has occupied psychologists and economists for decades, particularly in the context of financial fraud. Several cognitive biases contribute. Authority bias. People trust those who present themselves as experts. Nami had built companies, had celebrity endorsements, had academic presentations at his events. He looked legitimate. Social proof. People trust the decisions of others. If 37,000 people had invested, it must be valid. Why would so many people be wrong? Confirmation bias. Once someone invests, they interpret new information to support that decision. Warning signs are dismissed. Red flags are rationalized. Sunk cost fallacy. After investing significant money, pulling out means admitting loss. Easier to invest more, hoping to recover. But these cognitive biases alone don't explain the ENTEN's success. The cultural context was crucial. Japanese society emphasizes group harmony and mutual obligation. The ENTEN was framed as mutual assistance, not selfish speculation. You weren't trying to get rich, you were participating in a community. This framing removed moral qualms. Greed is shameful. Community support is virtuous. The same action, invested through different language, became acceptable. The social isolation of elderly Japanese magnified the effect. The ENTEN fairs provided more than shopping. They provided belonging, friendship, purpose. A 70-year-old widow living alone gained a social network through LNG. The money was almost secondary to the human connection. The economic desperation can't be underestimated. After 2 decades of stagnation, many elderly Japanese felt abandoned by the system they'd spent lifetimes supporting. They'd followed the rules, saved diligently, delayed gratification. And for what? 0% interest rates, shrinking pensions, politicians who promised reforms but delivered nothing. Nami offered an alternative. His system explicitly rejected traditional banking. It operated outside government regulation. It was a middle finger to the institutions that had failed them. Even if it was too good to be true, participating felt like rebellion, like refusing to accept the poverty they'd been consigned to. The parallels with Bernie Madoff are instructive. Both men ran Ponzi schemes, both targeted specific communities, both maintained operations for years before collapse. But the differences reveal cultural distinctions. Madoff targeted wealthy investors seeking to preserve capital while earning steady returns. Nami targeted middle-class retirees seeking community and hope. Madoff operated through exclusive word of mouth, creating artificial scarcity. Nami advertised openly, creating artificial abundance. Madoff maintained personal distance, rarely meeting investors directly. Nami cultivated personal relationships, attending fairs, giving speeches, making himself accessible. Madoff's fraud was invisible, hidden behind complex trading strategies. Nami's fraud was visible, but reframed as innovation. American victims demanded their money back. Japanese victims apologized for being greedy. The aftermath differed too. Madoff victims recovered approximately 70% of their principal through lawsuits and asset seizures. LNG's bankruptcy left little to recover. The company had spent most incoming funds on operations, products for fairs, salaries, and Nami's personal expenses. A few million yen were distributed among victims, pennies on the dollar. Most recovered nothing. Some victims died before resolution, having spent their final years in poverty, wondering how they'd been so foolish. Others survived, but never fully recovered financially or psychologically. The regulatory response was minimal. Japan didn't significantly change its laws regarding virtual currencies or investment schemes following the ENTEN collapse. The existing regulations had been adequate to prosecute Nami. The problem wasn't legal framework. The problem was enforcement and prevention. How do you stop people from believing promises that are too good to be true when they desperately want those promises to be real? Education helps. Financial literacy programs can teach warning signs of fraud, but education doesn't address the underlying needs that make people vulnerable. Loneliness, poverty, desperation, fear. These are social problems, not regulatory problems. Who was Kazutsugi Nami? 3 times he built empires from nothing. 3 times they collapsed. APO Japan, Nozaku, LNG. Each time the scheme grew more sophisticated, the products became more abstract, the promises more grandiose. By the end, he wasn't selling products at all. He was selling a concept, an economic philosophy, a vision of paradise where money fell from heaven and no one ever had to worry again. Did he believe his own rhetoric? The question is unanswerable but fascinating. Con artists generally fall into 2 categories: cold cynics who knowingly deceive for profit, true believers who convince themselves their impossible vision will somehow manifest if they just recruit enough followers, raise enough money, perfect the system slightly. Nami's behavior suggests elements of both. His previous convictions indicate he understood his schemes were fraudulent. He'd been arrested twice, served time, emerged, and immediately started new operations using similar mechanics. That's not the behavior of someone who genuinely believes he's innovating. That's the behavior of someone who knows he's running scams and simply gets better at them each iteration. Yet his statements during and after the arrest carry a tone of genuine conviction. His insistence that the ENTEN would be vindicated. His prediction that countries would adopt virtual currencies. His belief that he was the true victim. These don't sound like cynical lies. They sound like sincere delusion. Perhaps the truth is that Nami believed his own mythology while simultaneously understanding its impossibility. a paradoxical state where the conscious mind acknowledges fraud while the unconscious maintains faith in the vision. Or perhaps he evolved from cynic to believer over time. Started LNG as a deliberate scam, then gradually convinced himself the ENTEN could work if only it reached sufficient scale. The psychological literature on fraud suggests many con artists undergo this transition. They begin with conscious deception, but cognitive dissonance makes sustained lying psychologically uncomfortable. Easier to believe your own lies than to maintain the mental separation between public performance and private truth. His age is relevant. At 71, when he launched the ENTEN, Nami was facing his own mortality. His previous schemes had resulted in temporary profits followed by prison sentences. He'd spent years behind bars, had nothing to show for decades of fraud except a criminal record. Perhaps the ENTEN represented a final attempt at redemption. If he could make it work, if the system actually sustained itself, he'd transform from con man to innovator. His legacy would change. Instead of being remembered as a repeat offender, he'd be the man who revolutionized currency. A visionary persecuted by small-minded regulators who couldn't understand his genius. That narrative would have been immensely appealing to a 71-year-old man reviewing a life of crime and failure. The sexual dynamics add another layer. The Cosmo girls, the female journalists, the rumors of relationships and transactions. Nami was an elderly man who'd spent years in prison, isolated from intimacy and companionship. The ENTEN gave him power. Money, yes, but more importantly, attention. Attractive young women who had to be nice to him, laugh at his jokes, act interested in his theories. Whether those interactions remained professional or became sexual matters less than the psychological function they served. They validated his importance. They made him feel significant, viral, relevant. An old man surrounded by youth, still capable of attracting female attention. That's intoxicating, addictive, worth perpetuating the fraud for, even apart from financial gain. In prison, serving an 18-year sentence at age 76, Nami had ample time to reflect on these questions. Whether he did, or whether he spent his remaining years insisting he'd been right all along, we'll never know. He maintained relative silence after conviction. No interviews, no memoirs, no final confessions or explanations. He disappeared into the Japanese prison system and became a historical footnote. The man who invented money from heaven, the prophet who sold paradise and delivered poverty. A cautionary tale told in business schools and criminology courses about the mechanics of fraud and the psychology of belief. But the deeper lesson isn't about Nami. It's about his victims. 37,000 people who weren't stupid, weren't gullible, weren't unusually greedy. They were ordinary individuals facing difficult circumstances, offered a solution that seemed possible, validated by their peers, and desperate enough to suspend disbelief. The ENTEN worked because it addressed real needs: financial security, social connection, a sense of control in an unstable world. Nami didn't create those needs. He exploited them. But they existed before he arrived and persisted after he was arrested. The question isn't how one con man fooled so many people. The question is why so many people were vulnerable to being fooled. What failures in social support, economic policy, and community infrastructure created a population so desperate they'd believe in money from heaven? That question remains unanswered, which means the conditions that enabled the ENTEN still exist, waiting for the next Kazutsugi Nami to appear and promise paradise one more time.